When the attacks took place, I was in 5th grade, and I was just, a 5th grade student. And I didn't know anything at all during the school day except that we had indoor recess. But there was no hinting from my teachers, and we didn't really think anything was out of the ordinary except that it was, nice outside and we had indoor recess. And it wasn't until I got home that my neighbor, who was in the National Guard, was talking to my dad. And I remember that night my dad kind of pulled me aside and explained that there was, some people who had attacked buildings in New York City, and that it was probably going to impact, day-to-day life just based on the political response. But I was 11, so I didn't really understand. You kind of see it, the buildings are no longer standing, there's smoke, and probably people have been killed. But beyond that, at 11 years old, I wasn't, really aware of the implications. I do remember very vividly the next day when I went into school, though, because all the students had heard different things from their parents, and they'd spoken to different people. And when you're in 5th grade, people just, they say whatever they heard. There's no holding back. So I remember just, from friends who had parents who, knew more about, politics or the government. So you hear all these rumors and all these things, that we were at war, that we're not at war, that it was this guy, that it was this guy, that sort of thing. And I remember as an 11-year-old, it was really confusing because you didn't have anything to base that off of. It was something completely new. And all of a sudden, something had happened to your country, and you weren't really sure how it was going to impact you. I remember one classmate in particular. I don't really remember much else about him, but he said, we are at war, and all the guys who are over 18 are now going to have to go fight the bad guys, kind of like Vietnam, that sort of thing. So I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I have cousins, I have friends, and now they're all going to have to go, overseas to fight the bad guys. And of course that worries you as a kid. And I remember other things. The teachers sat us down and they explained, to some extent what had happened. But again, as an 11-year-old, you understand basically what happened, but you really don't understand how it would impact, your life in the next couple of years. I remember in the year after, it happened, my mother wanted to put up an American flag, because everybody was feeling patriotic. And I remember we had to wait like 3 months to get an American flag because everybody wanted one. And I remember as a kid thinking, wow, before I could just go and get an American flag wherever, but people wanted that patriotism and they wanted to show their support, for our government. And I remember that vividly, waiting for our flag. And obviously with the war in Iraq and the campaigns in Afghanistan and the political foreign policy events that followed definitely made me more aware that it wasn't just about the U.S., that we were in this world that was full of different countries that wanted different things. And even as a kid, you understand that, well, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe it's not just about what we've learned in school. Maybe there's people who want different things. And obviously whenever you're at war, that you see people around you, in uniform, and then they disappear, and then they come back, and some of them don't come back. And, you have that idea that, your country is involved with something that might be more complicated than you understand. And that was very evident from a young age, and then obviously as I got older and was able to more clearly kind of see what happened as a result of 9/11. The first person who kind of told me about 9/11 was, he trimmed yards, but he was in the National Guard, and he was called to Afghanistan. And I remember, okay, I know this person, I've known him, family friend, and now he's fighting in a war, which, is kind of difficult to understand as a kid. But, he was now, in a uniform, he wasn't mowing lawns anymore. Now he was, overseas. So there was that, and then of course, you have friends who have older brothers and older sisters, and who are just kind of waiting to see how things are going to pan out. And you kind of understand how, even though the war is so far away, and it's in a place that we really didn't have, at least I didn't really have an understanding of, it still brings it back to home, in your specific corner of the world, like it still impacts you. I remember specifically my teachers, when we were debating whether or not we were going to go to Iraq. I remember, we used to, the beginning of the year before we went into Iraq, we could talk about it. The teachers would bring it up. Like, what do you know? Let's talk about why we would go to Iraq, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, we went to Iraq and we couldn't talk about it anymore. And the teachers, were like, well, talk about it with your parents. Or, that's not relevant to what we're doing in class. Even social studies class, where it was absolutely relevant. And I remember all of a sudden, like, well, 3 months ago, we could have an open discussion. Everybody, could talk and bring up their ideas. And now all of a sudden, it's something you can talk about at home, but it's not something for school. When it happened when I was 11, my only real understanding of the Middle East was that I had family in Israel. So I knew about, Israel. And that was really the only introduction I had to the region. I wasn't really, I was aware, vaguely where it was, but I didn't really have any prejudices or preconceived notions. And I remember when it became clear kind of who was responsible for 9/11, when we could kind of target a group in the Middle East, and we had that narrowed down after all the smoke had cleared. And everybody was like, well, it was because of Islam, radical Islam, terrorism equates to radical Islam, things like that. And I mean, it was almost surprising looking back how openly prejudiced people were, even teachers and like trusted adults, because this had happened and everybody was kind of scared and nervous and angry. And it was very convenient to paint the this enemy that everybody could kind of recognize as an enemy as being, a Muslim from the Middle East. And I remember, early Iraq and as a child kind of becoming aware that, that was the bad guy, that's what the bad guy looked like. The people who attacked us had been, Muslims. And of course, as I got older and started learning more about Islam and things like that, you realize that a lot of maybe what you believed or what you were told is not entirely accurate. But at the time, and to some extent, today, a lot of people are living under that notion that Muslims attacked us, Muslims still want to attack us, and unless we stop them, we'll continue to attack us. And I think that's what's led to modern Islamophobia at the Cultural Center, in Manhattan, things like that. People may say that they're not prejudiced against Muslims, but to some extent, that's illogical when you look at, we have people running for office who are openly prejudiced against Muslims, who that's part of their campaign ideology. It's not, they're not even hiding it. If it was about any other group of people, you couldn't get away with that. People would be appalled. But somehow it's okay for somebody running for office to say that they need to stop mosques being built. And that, I think, is a direct consequence of some of the reaction to 9/11. There's a lot of criticism about how the Bush administration handled 9/11, and there's a lot of criticism about some of the decisions made by top policymakers in the Bush administration and outside of the Bush administration. And I think it's important to keep in mind that 9/11 happened and there's no recipe for reaction. It's not like this is how you're supposed to react when you're attacked, like we were. I mean, this was relatively new in the sense that it was completely unexpected, and this was the response that we had, and it wasn't obviously a perfect response. But people need to realize that, to be realistic, that's a reactionary response. And, you can be completely prepared, but it's not like you can have that perfect formula to combat things like 9/11 or things like terrorism, that it has to be an evolving strategy, and that we have to keep an open mind. Because saying things like all Muslims are terrorists doesn't solve any problem. It's not going to make the public more, ready should another terrorist attack, occur. And it really just masks underlying problems, which we need to spend more time understanding, obviously, to devise a strategy that will keep, the country safe. And I think people, we should look at how we reacted to 9/11, and we can criticize it so that we know, in the future what mistakes not to make again. But then we also need to realize that as a country, we should be able to adapt and, keep an open mind, because that's really the only way to deal with the unknown. And 9/11, I think, represents that unknown factor in foreign policy, because you can prepare and you can have the best security and the best military, but things can still go wrong. And when we keep a closed mind and are judgmental or prejudiced, then we, I think, compromise national security instead of enhancing it. I think I became more aware of maybe our response to 9/11 through, my political science classes as an international relations major. Obviously, it's almost impossible to analyze American foreign policy without talking about 9/11, because modern American foreign policy is a direct result in many ways of 9/11 and of terrorism. And you can't separate American foreign policy and terrorism. So in every class I've had, whether we're talking about Latin America, the Middle East, whatever, it always comes back to the war on terror, when you're talking about modern foreign policy. So it's impossible to kind of study it without being aware of the implications of 9/11. And of course in Model UN, the different countries that I've had the opportunity to represent have ranged. We've done Israel, Guatemala, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which are from 3 completely different parts of the country. And yet, every single time I've researched it, it's come down to 9/11 because, the United States, that is so much a part of how we project ourselves in the international community. So it's important, even if it's a country that was relatively unaffected by September 11th or by terrorism in general, the context of terrorism broadly as an international phenomena impacts almost every country, even if it's indirectly. So the study of modern, international relations, whether it was, from me taking notes in a classroom or in Model UN or this summer when I interned at the Defense Department, that is something that is a major force in our foreign policy, domestically and internationally.